Welcome to the second annual symposium with Gadsby's Tavern Museum and Emerging Rev War. Hindsight is 2020, Misconceptions of the Revolution. My name is Liz Williams, and I'm the director of Gadsby's Tavern Museum with the Office of Historic Alexandria. It is an honor to partner with Emerging Rev War at this very important time in our nation's history, a time to consider America's foundings in preparation for the coming 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. At Gadsby's Tavern Museum, the complexity of early America is a prominent theme, and we are excited to examine more closely with fresh eyes the decades prior to that, the pivotal time of the Revolution. Let me introduce quickly the co-founders of Emerging Rev War, who will be assisting us today, Rob Orison and Phil Greenwalt. And then I have a few important housekeeping notes before we hand it over to Travis. For the flow of the day, we'll have a presentation for about 40 minutes, Q&A for about 10, then a 10-minute Zoom break for our next speaker. For those presenters that have books, we will be sharing how you can get signed copies during the Q's and A's. With that, let me hand it off to Rob to introduce our first speaker.
Great, thank you, Liz, and it's very happy to be here this morning. We're going to have a great time today. We have some great speakers. Our first speaker is a good friend of mine, Travis Shaw. Travis is the current director of education for the Virginia Piedmont Heritage Area. He brings nearly 2 decades of experience in the fields of historic preservation, archaeology, and museum education, working with both private and public institutions. Prior to joining Virginia Piedmont Heritage Area, Travis spent time at Historic St. Mary's, the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Lab, Mount Vernon, and Oatlands Historic Site and Gardens. He holds a BA in history from St. Mary's College of Maryland and an MA in history with a concentration in public history from American University. He has written numerous articles for the American Battlefield Trust. If you look closely, you might also spot him in numerous historical films, including Mount Vernon and the Boston Tea Party Ships and Museums. Also, Travis is probably pretty famous on YouTube and online because Travis, I think you do about 3 or 4 videos a week, virtual programs during this COVID time. So Travis is well-versed in doing virtual presentations. So it's my honor to welcome Travis as he presents Disaffected and Dangerous Persons, Loyalist Resistance in the Mid-Atlantic. Travis?
All right, thank you so much, Rob and Liz. It's a pleasure to be here today. With that, I'll go ahead and jump right in. Let me get the screen share going here. Let's see. Everybody see that all right? Good. So, in 1936, the American author Stephen Vincent Benet releases one of my favorite works of American literature and quite a famous short story, and that is The Devil and Daniel Webster. It's a story about a New Hampshire farmer who sells his soul to the devil in exchange for prosperity. And when the devil comes to collect his due, this farmer enlists the famous orator Daniel Webster as his defense to try and get out of this compact with Satan. There's a really well done film version from 1941 you can see here, but even if you've never seen it, even if you've never read the short story, you're probably familiar with it because it has been parodied dozens and dozens of times in pop culture, probably most famously on The Simpsons. Really great episode. One of the central themes of this story, The Devil and Daniel Webster, is that during the trial for this man's soul, the jury is made up of the greatest villains in American history. In the case of The Simpsons, you've got Richard Nixon, you've got Lizzie Borden, the 1976 Philadelphia Flyers. In the original story, however, it's villains from America's founding. You have people like the notorious pirate Blackbeard. You have Thomas Dale, the heavy-handed governor of the Jamestown colony. You have King Philip, the Native American leader, namesake of King Philip's War. And most prominently, you have a number of American loyalists from the Revolutionary War. You have Simon Girty. You have Walter Butler. At one point, they ask, where is Benedict Arnold? He's away on other business. Otherwise, he'd probably be the foreman of the jury. So here we are in the early 20th century, and yet the greatest villains in American history include these Loyalists. Throughout the 19th and 20th century, Loyalists are portrayed as kind of the arch villains of America's past. They're people who resisted the founding of the Republic. They're portrayed as proud, very petty, sometimes kind of clownishly incompetent, sometimes bloodthirsty savages. Really, all of these kind of stereotypes play into the popular conception of American loyalists, even hundreds of years after the conflict had ended. And, you know, in many ways, this obscures the reality of American loyalism. American loyalism is incredibly complex. So what we're going to do today is we're going to take a look back at two events in particular that occur in 1781 that I think help give a more complete, more well-rounded view of the types of people that resisted American independence, and perhaps give a more complex view of the events surrounding our nation's birth. Before we do that, though, I'd like to spend a few minutes just kind of giving a general overview of the Loyalists. You know, this image here is kind of a rough sketch of a later painting showing Britain receiving her loyal subjects after the end of the war. You know, in most modern scholarship, most modern people who study loyalism put the number of loyalists in America during the Revolutionary War at about 20 to 25% of the population. So we're certainly not talking about a majority, but we are talking about an incredibly sizable minority of people in the colonies. You know, 20 to 25%, we're talking about at least 500,000 people in the American colonies could be defined as loyalists. Now, whether that means passive loyalism in the sense that maybe, you know, they're resisting the Continental Congress in passive ways, you know, giving intelligence, giving supplies, giving shelter to British forces, refusing to pay their taxes or to, you know, submit to Continental Congress's demands for goods or men. Or active loyalism. In that case, we're talking about men who are actually taking up arms and fighting on behalf of the crown. We're talking a substantial number of people. So I guess the question really becomes, why? Where are these people coming from? Why do they make the choices that they make? And in general, we can kind of break these motivations down, that some of these motivations do overlap substantially, but there's a few kind of core principles at work here. The first and kind of the biggest is political conservatism. It's important for us to remember now, you know, we're talking about hindsight being 2020. At the start of the American Revolution, British subjects are really kind of the freest and least taxed, greatest political rights of any people in the Western world. Most British subjects could simply point across the English Channel and say, well, look at France, look at Spain, look further on the continent to places like the Habsburg monarchy or to Russia. These are absolutist powers. In England, we have a constitution, we have rights that are guaranteed for Englishmen. And even across the Atlantic here in the American colonies, as I said, the subjects are being taxed less than any subjects within the British Empire or certainly within the rest of the European system. So there are very deep kind of conservative political roots to this. For most 18th century Englishmen, the ideas of a republic or a democracy, well, that's akin to anarchy. You know, there's kind of a feeling or a saying that better one king 1,000 miles away than 1,000 kings 1 mile away, and that representative government pretty quickly gives way to mob rule. You know, these loyalists would certainly see themselves as the forces of law and order in a kind of anarchic society. For others loyalists, it's a more personal connection. Many people living in the American colonies still had family ties to those over in Britain. Economic ties, certainly the hotbed of loyalism here in Virginia is going to be seen as the southeastern part of the colony, the area around Norfolk. This is an area that is very cosmopolitan, very dependent on shipping and economic ties. So even if you're not a wealthy merchant, you might be a shipbuilder or a rope maker or a ship chandler, someone whose livelihood is tied to this kind of global economic system that revolves around the British Empire. And that's certainly true in a lot of other colonies. I think we have a perception that most loyalists are incredibly wealthy people, people who have status and money to lose. But the reality is we're going to see people from across the spectrum, from every political class and station in life, who have some sort of tie to Britain or to the empire. Geography can be very important. We're going to see that in the events that I'm going to discuss later on. Certain areas, again, are geographically tied to the empire. We tend to see a lot of loyalists in the large cities on the seaboard. Again, cities that are tied to the global trade of the empire, cities that are full of recent immigrants from the British Isles. But we also see large numbers of loyalists on the frontier. These are areas that are most directly receiving the protection of British soldiers. They don't see soldiers as an occupying force. They see them as a means of protection. We are going to see a lot of religious and ethnic minorities turn to loyalism. Again, that fear of mob rule, the fear that the mob is going to kind of subsume them. You see, as far as ethnic groups go, in particular, of course, Native Americans are going to look to the crown as kind of a stabilizing and protecting force. A lot of African Americans will turn to the crown as a means of gaining their freedom from enslavement during the war. In the Carolinas and in Western Virginia, many of Scots are going to be associated with loyalism, particularly the Highland Scots. In Virginia, in a lot of 18th century documents, the word Scotsman or Scot is almost always associated with being a Tory or being a loyalist. Religious groups like Quakers, non-violent pacifist groups, their nonviolence is going to be seen as kind of a suspicious trait, kind of a backdoor into passive loyalism. These people don't want to support the war effort against the British, therefore they must be with the British. And then lastly, simply opportunism. A lot of people will be a loyalist when the British Army is in the neighborhood, and then when the Continental Army comes marching through, they will all of a sudden change their tune. This is perhaps, I think, one of the most misunderstood aspects of loyalism, and something that we're going to see in the events that we'll talk about, is that loyalism is not a static thing. It is not set in stone. People's political convictions waver over time. They can change over time. There's definitely a sliding scale or a spectrum of kind of loyalist versus patriot support. And one of the biggest factors that's going to influence that is who is in charge at this particular moment in time. We see this constantly throughout the war. A really great example is going to be during the British occupation of Philadelphia. As the American army is kind of huddled outside the city at Valley Forge, locals are going to be bringing food and other supplies into the city and selling them to the British, simply because the British are in power. The British seem like they're on the winning side at this point. They have hard money to pay. So there's definitely some opportunism at play. And then lastly, I call it personal retribution. We are going to see time and time again, including in the events I'm going to talk about, that for some people, the American Revolution is not necessarily a political struggle. It is going to be a personal struggle. And this is played out brutally throughout the Carolinas during the latter part of the war. It's going to play out in New Jersey. It's going to play out along the frontier. For many people, your enemy is whichever side your neighbor might happen to pick. If you've got a problem with the guy, if you years ago he stole land from you, or you've gotten into it over cattle or whatever other personal problems you might have with these people, that could definitely play out kind of under the guise of this conflict between rebels and loyalists, in the sense that, you know, it gives you an opportunity, it gives you kind of legal cover to exact retribution. So all of these factors, as I said, many of these can be intertwined, many of these overlap, but they are going to be important motivators for loyalists. You know, I would say that there's just as many motivations as there were loyalists. You know, everybody has their own kind of combination of these factors that play into their decision. So with that, I said we're going to look at two events that occurred in the Mid-Atlantic in 1781. And the reason I chose these events is, again, our theme this year is hindsight. And with hindsight, we look at the year 1781 as the year the revolution is won. It's the year of the surrender at Yorktown, kind of the end of major hostilities here in the North American continent. But for the people living through 1781, the future certainly was a lot murkier. You have to remember that in 1781, at the beginning of the year, you have Cornwallis leading an army through the Carolinas. And although he's going to suffer several setbacks, the Americans are unable to stop or destroy his army. And of course, Charleston, the most important city in the South, had fallen the previous year. Washington and his army are kind of stuck outside of New York. They're not powerful enough to take New York from the British, but the British there certainly can't be left unattended. The French alliance that so many people had put their hopes on really had not amounted to much in terms of battlefield success. The Franco-American forces had been turned back at Savannah. They had been turned back in Rhode Island. So this alliance that had begun with such promise really had fizzled out up until this point, at least in terms of battlefield success. And here in Virginia, of course, early in 1781, you have a large British and Loyalist force landed under the command of Benedict Arnold. That's going to be reinforced throughout the spring. Cornwallis is going to join forces with this force and basically bring the war to Virginia in a way that Virginians had not experienced before. So there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty in 1781. We like to think that it was all kind of said and done by that point, but that was not the case. And that is going to directly lead to the events of both Claypool's rebellion in Virginia and this wider conspiracy in Maryland that both occur in the spring and summer of 1781. So we'll begin with Claypool's rebellion. Claypool's rebellion, to set the scene here, the part of Virginia that we are going to really focus on is an area known as Hampshire County. It's now in eastern West Virginia, but at this point in 1781, it's about a generation or so removed from truly being the frontier. We are seeing sparse settlement in the area, particularly along the major rivers. We're talking about the South Branch of the Potomac River. We're talking about the Lost River, the Cacapon, or however you say that. I'm not a West Virginian. But this area is really kind of the leading edge of heavy settlements, particularly along the rivers, particularly along the few turnpike roads that are kind of first being built out into the area. As with much of the southern frontier, we're talking about Scots-Irish immigrants, coming from Ulster and Northern Ireland. We're talking about Scots coming from Scotland proper, and a lot of German settlers as well. This is kind of the ethnic mix that we see in Western Pennsylvania. We see kind of coming down from the Great Valley of Pennsylvania, spreading into the Shenandoah Valley and westward across the mountains into these river valleys in Hampshire County. Just to put it in some modern context, this is the area we're talking about. So Moorfield, West Virginia is kind of the heart of this area, down to Petersburg, West Virginia, the Lost River Valley towards Wardensville. So just over the mountains from the Shenandoah Valley. So in April of 1781, Colonel Garrett Van Meter, who's the commanding colonel of the militia out in Hampshire County, writes a letter to Governor Thomas Jefferson. And in it, he is going to describe basically the panic that is sweeping across this area in the early part of 1781. So we're talking he says, quote, A dangerous insurrection has lately arisen in this county, occasioned by the execution of the late acts of assembly for recruiting this state's quota of troops to serve in the Continental Army, and the act for supplying the army with clothes, provisions, and wagons, in consequence of which the collector of the tax under the former act has been opposed in the execution of his duty and has been obliged to desist from any further proceedings therein. So there's a lot going on here. And what he is referring to is this new tax that has been passed to help support the war effort. You know, the war has been going on for 6 years at this point. Virginia has kind of up until this point been more or less untouched by the war. So Virginia is really serving as kind of a breadbasket for the Continental Army, supplying everything from grain and meat, cattle, livestock, wagons, you know, any kind of supplies that are going to help keep the army in the field. Well, at this time, around 1781, a tax has been passed at 80% of your personal property. So if you own 100 pounds worth of property, you're going to be taxed 80 pounds on that to help keep the army in the field. This is an incredibly onerous tax on anyone living in Virginia at this time. We're also talking about the requisitioning of men and supplies. So on top of this tax that is being paid in money, you are expected to supply the army with livestock, food, and men. You know, Van Meter, just prior to this, is actually complaining that he's sent 50 of the local militiamen down south to help assist with Nathaniel Greene's army, and they're being taken into the army rather than serving their term and being returned to Hampshire County. So, you know, husbands, brothers, fathers are being taken from their farms and put into the army to serve. So this is going to be hugely important in 1780, 1781. Another thing that's important to point out is this is not the first Loyalist disturbance that has occurred in this area. In 1777, 3 years prior, or 4 years prior, a force of 70 men was raised by William Hinton, one of the settlers out in Rockingham County. They're being raised to fight for the British. This disturbance is put down. The ringleaders are arrested, put in jail. Everyone's kind of dispersed. But it's going to start a snowball effect along the Western Virginia frontier. These arrests and retributions are going to continue through the late 1770s and into the 1780s. In April of 1780, just a year prior to this, a guy named Sebastian Hoover was killed by a Loyalist neighbor of his. This kind of violence, this tit-for-tat violence, is going to start spreading through 1780 and really prime the people of Western Virginia for what will occur in spring of 1781, this more widespread resistance. You know, to this day, there's actually an area in Randolph County now in West Virginia called Tory Camp Creek, because many of these people who resisted these efforts to tax, these efforts to raise men and supplies, would actually just up and flee into the hills and into the hollows of this very mountainous and sparsely populated area. So there's a lot of minor disturbances going on, but this time in April of 1781, it's very different. This time we actually have a British army in Virginia that is operating in Virginia. So what had previously been kind of isolated incidents now is seen as part of a much wider conspiracy to raise men to join Cornwallis and to kind of overthrow congressional authority in Virginia. And this is, again, one of the main impulses. Van Meter is out in the county trying to raise 240 militia to march to Williamsburg to help defend the colony. And that's really what is going to kick off what is known as Claypool's Rebellion. So April 11th, Van Meter writes this letter to Jefferson saying there's resistance. People don't want to pay these taxes. I can't get my tax collector out to actually execute this duty because the people are upset. When the tax collector comes through the Lost River area, they are going to be confronted by a group of armed men. This group of armed men is under the leadership of a local settler, a guy named John Claypool. And They are going to, quote, declare that they would not make up any clothes, beef, or men for the congressional forces. And then Claypool is going to distribute liquor amongst these men, and they're going to drink to King George III's health and damnation to the Congress. Now, this may not seem like a serious incident, but again, within the context of what's going on with Cornwallis's army in Virginia, people start to panic in Richmond and over the mountains in the eastern part of Virginia. A few days later, the sheriff is sent to arrest Claypool for this little display that he had put on. And he shows up with a posse of 50 men to put Claypool in irons. And when they arrive at Claypool's rendezvous spot, they are going to be confronted by an even larger group of armed men, probably 70 or 80 armed men. And wisely, the sheriff kind of agrees to back down at this point, but Claypool's rebellion has begun in earnest. So what do we know about John Claypool? Not a whole lot, to be honest. We know that he was born in 1733. Accounts differ as to where he comes from. Some say he was born in Rockingham County out there in Western Virginia, although other sources say maybe he was born in Delaware and that his parents had moved to the area as a young man. He's described as a Scotsman, and again, as I mentioned earlier, Scots are really heavily, especially in Virginia, associated with Toryism or with loyalism. There's this idea that they are almost kind of an alien people who are alien in the sense that they're a different people, a different culture that is not to be trusted. Many of the most prominent Scotsmen in Virginia at the start of the Revolution are loyalists. Certainly Lord Dunmore, the last royal governor of the colony, is a perfect example of this. We do know that Claypool had settled along the Lost River in the 1750s. His family is very locally prominent. They have a lot of connections to the local government. So certainly not a poor farmer, a well-established family at this time. Pretty middling in the sense of the type of people we see out in this area. Certainly not poor, fairly well connected. So the epicenter of Claypool's rebellion is going to be the farm of a man named John Brake. John Brake, unlike Claypool, is a German immigrant, and he's certainly a very prominent man, probably more prominent than Claypool himself. He owns a lot of land, he owns a mill, some other industries there along the river, about 15 miles or so south of modern-day Moorfield. The Brake Farm is going to become the rendezvous point for Claypool and his rebels. And when we look at the men who are making up this rebellion, it's a lot of, as I said, kind of immigrants, German immigrants, Scottish immigrants. These people are fairly poor. These are the people that 80% tax is going to fall very heavily on. These are the people that are actually being called up into military duty. At this point, Virginia has instituted a levy system where men can be taken from the militia and forced to serve in the Continental Army for a period of months. So many men desert. They resist this. One of the local informants said that, "I am informed there are several deserters amongst those people. Some are English prisoners. So we have English prisoners from the British Army that have been held in the Charlottesville area or the Winchester area who have made their way over the mountains to escape. We also have some 18 months men and 8 months men. These are militiamen who've been drafted into the army for a period of time and do not want to go and serve. So they are going to join this rebellion. There is some claim that there are English agents circulating through the area trying to convince these men to rebel. Whether or not there's any proof to that has never conclusively really been proven. I think there's, as with any kind of conspiracy like this, there's a lot of theories that are floating around, a lot of misinformation, a lot of panic. But the fear has a very real effect on the Virginia government. There's fear that these men are going to join with Cornwallis. There's fear that they might march north into Maryland and burn Hagerstown to the ground. So there's a lot going on in the spring of 1781. And here's a modern view of where the Brake Farm is today, kind of courtesy of Google. The log building you see on the left is an original 18th century building that would have been there at the time, but there would have been a much larger farm and mill complex located here. It also gives you a good idea of what the terrain looks like. This is an area of very heavily wooded area. It's a lot of hills and hollows, the perfect place to kind of lead an insurrection. And it's here at the Brake Farm that Colonel Van Meter is going to send a mounted column of militia to, again, break up this rebellion before it takes off. When they arrive at the Brake Farm, they're actually going to be greeted by an exchange of gunfire. Van Meter and his force are going to be pushed back in an armed exchange. And this is at the point where the Virginia authorities decide something more seriously needs to be done. And so they're going to call upon probably Virginia's second greatest hero of the Revolution after George Washington himself. And that is going to be Daniel Morgan, the old wagoner. In early 1781, Daniel Morgan has left the army. He's returned home to Winchester, to the Winchester area. He's suffering from a lot of health issues. He's been kind of passed over a few times for command. He feels like he hasn't quite gotten his due. But certainly his health at this point is beginning to fail him. But Morgan agrees to raise a group of men to march over the mountains into the Lost River Valley, into the South Fork Valley, and put an end to Claypool's rebellion before it can snowball out of control. So he will assemble 400 men from the surrounding counties. They will march over the mountains here. And if you look at the map here, we can see the Winchester area, over the mountains and into the South Branch Valley. And they are going to first stop at John Claypool's property as they're marching out. And it's here that Claypool and his rebels will confront Daniel Morgan. There's a brief exchange of gunfire. John Brake, kind of Claypool's second in command, is killed in the exchange. Claypool and himself and most of the other men under his command will scatter. They will head to the hills. They will head to these kind of remote little hollows and valleys, and absolutely flee in terror in the face of Daniel Morgan and this much larger, much more better trained and equipped force of men. The next stop on Daniel Morgan's march will be the Brake Farm itself, and he and his men will make themselves there quite comfortably for the next few days, living off of the Brake family's livestock and crops. As they're occupying this area, many of the men who had resisted, who had taken up arms in support of John Claypool, will begin to turn themselves in. They really don't have the stomach for a fight. And so over the next 3 weeks, most of the rebels will turn themselves in. And this is going to include John Claypool himself. So what we refer to as the Claypool Rebellion really is not a huge disturbance. It's certainly, I think Daniel Morgan was right in kind of just striking at the heart of it, going after the two main ringleaders, breaking it up before this rebellion can really grow into a much more serious threat. So the aftermath of the rebellion, most of the men are pardoned. Most of them plea to the Virginia authorities that they had been misled, that they really, their quarrel was not with, that they were people who were really rebelling not because they were against the revolution, but because they were against the taxation and the hardship that the war was bringing, and that they had been misled by these evil and wicked ringleaders who kind of put them on this path towards supporting the British. And many of the men who had taken up arms actually agree to form a company and march off in support of Lafayette's army, as a way of kind of showing their good faith towards the American cause. Many of the ringleaders are going to petition directly to the governor of Virginia, who at this point is Governor Harrison, for clemency. And we can see there's a transcription of that petition here. They say, they were induced to join the late conspiracy against the state, the object of which was to refuse the payment of taxes and to oppose the act for raising troops. So again, they're kind of couching this not in terms of support for Britain, but opposition to taxation and drafting of men. Both Colonel Van Meter, the militia colonel in Hampshire County, and Daniel Morgan himself will support this movement towards pardoning the rebels. Daniel Morgan says, quote, "I can truly say this is the first time I ever spoke in favor of a Tory and ever wished their lives spared them. But humanity as well as policy urges me to say something in favor of Claypool and wish he may obtain forgiveness." So even Daniel Morgan is arguing for leniency. And Claypool himself, the ringleader of this kind of nascent rebellion on the Virginia frontier, will be pardoned by the governor of Virginia. He's released from captivity, and Claypool and the rest of his conspirators will go home to their homes along the Lost River, along the South Fork. And Claypool will actually live in peace for the remainder of his life. He dies there at the age of 89, in total peace and prosperity for the rest of his life. This will not be the case for our next group of loyalists that we're going to discuss. So I'm going to talk about a conspiracy. I refer to it as the Frederick Seven. There's no good kind of sexy or exciting name for this rebellion because it is much wider, but at the same time, much less well-formed than Claypool's rebellion. So June of 1781, very similar letter arrives, this time at the government of Maryland. The information is given to this board to have good reason to believe that Henry Newcomer and Bleachy of Washington County and Fritchie, Kelly, and Tinkles, these are all individuals, of Frederick County, are disaffected and dangerous persons whose going at large may be detrimental to the state. So again, we have this kind of information arrives that there's this nebulous idea that these dangerous people are afoot and that they're plotting against the state. This conspiracy grows out of the same disaffection that's affecting those in Virginia. Again, 6 years of war have taken a heavy toll on the people of Western Maryland. We're talking about, again, men, supplies, food, livestock being taken from these communities to support the war effort, and heavy taxation to support the war effort. The area that we're talking about is a wide area, basically from modern Frederick, Maryland, west to Hagerstown, Maryland, a lot of the small towns in between, Sharpsburg, Boonesboro. This is going to be the heart of this plot. So one of the first identified leaders is one of the guys in that letter, a guy named Henry Newcomer. He lives in Sharpsburg. You Civil War people have probably heard of the Newcomer farm as one of the landmarks at Antietam. This is the same family, the Newcomers. One night, Henry Newcomer is going to confide to one of his neighbors that they, quote, raised a body of men for the service of the king, and that there's a Dutchman named Fritchie over in Frederick who is going to lead this body of men to join with Lord Cornwallis. Now, unfortunately for Newcomer, the man he confides in is Christian Orndorff. Christian Orndorff is an officer in the Continental Army. He's been captured very early on in the war, but released on parole. He's returned to Sharpsburg, and he is going to really play this up. Orndorff is going to feign kind of disgust and disappointment with the Continental cause, and he is really going to start kind of pumping Newcomer for more and more information on this plot. Like, how can I get involved? Who else is involved? What kind of men have you enlisted for this plot? And predictably, he is going to turn around and report everything he has heard from Newcomer straight to the Maryland authorities. And it's going to become clear that just as with Claypool's rebellion in Virginia, disaffection is really spread far and wide throughout Western Maryland. One of the conspirators who's caught up in this later claimed that they had gotten oaths of allegiance to the crown from over 6 6,000 individuals. I think he's probably lying about this, but that certainly plays to the belief that this is a widespread and very deep conspiracy against the American cause. Whether or not they had 6,000 people involved, they do start making arrests. The Maryland authorities will start picking up dozens of people and imprisoning them in Washington County and in Frederick County, Maryland. The authorities quickly zero in on 7 ringleaders who are associated with this plot. They're Nicholas Andrews, John Graves, and Adam Graves, 2 brothers, Jost Plecker, Henry Schell or Heinrich Schul, depending on whether we're using his English or German name, Peter Suman, and Caspar Fritchie. Now you'll notice a few things about these names. Again, there's a lot of Germans on this list. Again, German immigrants are going to be associated with this plot, just as they kind of had been with Claypool's rebellion. Again, these people are a lot of recent immigrants. Also, there's a lot of Germans who are fighting alongside the crown, German auxiliaries, the feared Hessians who are fighting with the British. So there's a lot of kind of anti-German sentiment that goes into this conspiracy. Peter Suman in particular, he is a member of the Brethren Church, which is a pacifist sect. So here's someone who's kind of suspect to begin with, because he has up until this point refused to support the Continental cause because of his pacifist beliefs. So, these are the 7 ringleaders. And one of the local militia commanders, a guy named Thomas Sprigg, I think summed up the feelings towards these 7 men when he said that they have admitted to administering the oath of allegiance to many persons. They confess very freely that they expect and deserve to be hanged, and I pray God they may not be disappointed. So unlike Claypool's rebellion, where the ringleaders are pardoned, the state of Maryland is not going to take as kind of a view of these 7 ringleaders. The ringleaders are brought to the courthouse in Frederick, where they're going to face a special tribunal, a court of oyer and terminer. This goes back to the medieval days. It is a special court where they will not be tried by a jury, but instead will be tried by a panel of men specifically appointed for crimes like treason. The judges selected were James Johnson, local militia commander, also the brother of Governor Thomas Johnson; Alexander Hanson, the son of Maryland Continental Congress member John Hanson, one of the first presidents of the Congress; and Upton Sheridan, a local judge and state senator. All 3 of these men are known for being very, very, very committed to the Continental Congress, to the American cause, and for having an extremely harsh stance towards any suspected loyalists. So there's really no semblance that these men are being tried by an impartial court. The deck is stacked against them. And it is not going to take long for them to reach a conclusion in this trial. Christian Orndorff, the Continental officer who had overheard all of this to begin with, he is going to basically be the star witness. He is going to testify against these men. And within a matter of just a few days, the trial is over and all 7 men are going to be found guilty. The sentence: you shall be carried to the jail of Fredericktown and hanged therein. You shall be cut down to the earth alive. Your entrails shall be taken out and burnt while you are yet alive. Your heads shall be cut off. Your body shall be divided into 4 parts, and your heads and quarters shall be placed where His Excellency the Governor shall appoint. This is drawing and quartering. This is positively medieval stuff here. This is a punishment that we don't really associate with the American Revolution. We associate with a much more brutal age, to again kind of call back to some pop culture here. Anyone who has seen the end of the movie Braveheart knows exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about them being hung, cut down, cut open, ripped apart, beheaded. This is a message to anyone else who might be considering rising up against the continental or congressional authority within the state of Maryland. This is a punishment that is reserved for the worst of traitors in kind of the absolutist kingdoms of old Europe. Here's the thing, though. We don't know if it was actually carried out. We do know, and here's actually, this is the writ for Suman himself, which still survives, telling the sheriff to carry out this brutal punishment. We do know that 3 of the ringleaders, Fritchie, Plecker, and Suman, were brought out in front of the courthouse onto the grounds. This is the modern city hall in Frederick, which stands on the courthouse grounds where these executions were taking place. On Friday, August 17th, those 3 were brought to the courthouse, and we know that they were executed. The local papers, contemporary sources just say that they were killed. Family lore and the legend says that at least one of them, at least Suman, was hung, drawn, and quartered according to the punishment put out by the court. Some say that the crowd and the executioners lost their stomach after witnessing such a horrific and barbaric execution, and that the other 2 were simply hanged until they were dead. Whatever the case, 3 of the men were killed. The other 4, however, were pardoned, or at least they had their stay of execution. Rather than being hung, drawn, and quartered or executed, they will be released and actually sent to the French Navy. The French warships are, of course, in the Chesapeake Bay at this time. These men are given a reprieve. They're being told, you are going to serve the rest of your life on a French warship, basically impressed as a sailor. And if you ever set foot on Maryland again, you will be executed immediately. We know this because 3 of those men later escaped. The Graves brothers and one of the other men, I believe it's Andrews, later escape and find their way to British-held New York. And those 3 are given actually Loyalist claims. They file claims with the British government. So not everyone was as lucky as those 3. Everyone had their property confiscated. This was particularly hard on the Fritchie family. It left behind his widow and 11 young children with no means of support. Suman's family suffers a very similar fate. Later on in the 1790s, both Suman is actually, his widow is going to have some of that property returned to him. And many think that that might be in response to the realization that he probably didn't have much to do with this conspiracy. He was simply a pacifist who got caught up in this kind of mania against this suspected Loyalist plot. And in case anyone is super into the Civil War out there, the name Caspar Fritchie might ring a bell. Caspar Fritchie is the father of John Caspar Fritchie, who later marries Barbara Howard, the famous Barbara Fritchie, the flag-waving heroine of the 1862 Maryland campaign. So there is a really kind of fascinating Civil War connection to this story. So in conclusion, what can we kind of take from these stories? We're talking about hindsight. We're talking about looking back on some of the misconceptions of the past. As I mentioned earlier, one of the main takeaways is we look back at 1781 as the end of the revolution in many ways, at least the Revolutionary War. For the people of 1781, this was not the case. And although it's easy for us to look back and say, well, things were kind of done, the writing was on the wall, the situation was still up in the air enough that people in Maryland and Virginia were willing to put their lives on the line to support British cause. It was still, in their view, likely that the British would win this conflict. It's a perfect example of how loyalism is not a clear-cut, set-in-stone division in society. There are men who participated in Claypool's rebellion and in this uprising who had served for the Continental cause. But by 1781, they are facing taxation, they are facing all of the burdens of the war and of Congress's authority, and they decide that they are going to change their mind. We also see men who participate in both of these events that end up then turning around and serving in the Patriot cause later on. They've kind of seen the error of their ways. They've, been faced with this choice that you serve for the Patriots, you serve the Patriot cause, or else, you will be punished. And I think the most important takeaway is that sometimes Patriots and Loyalists were kind of fighting for the same thing. The American rebels would have claimed that they are fighting for self-government. They are fighting for, against arbitrary government, arbitrary taxation, the tyranny that has been imposed upon them by the British government. Well, the participants of both Claypool's rebellion and this Western Maryland conspiracy absolutely were fighting for the same thing. These are men who probably were never taxed harder or called upon more by the government, had the government impose restrictions on their lives more strenuously than they did in 1781, than they did by the governments of Maryland and Virginia versus the Crown of Great Britain. So there's a lot of, I think, kind of common cause, at least in why these men were taking up arms, why these men were resisting. They were just resisting they just took two very different paths towards what they thought would assure them the greatest amount of freedom and prosperity. And I think that certainly adds an extra layer of complexity to how we look at the American Revolution. With that, I know I've kind of ran up on some time here, but if anybody has any questions, I would love to answer them.
All right. Thank you, Travis. Actually, you don't have that many questions. One person did ask, and I'll just ask you for your opinion on this. How would you define Mid-Atlantic? So which colonies would you consider Mid-Atlantic? I know, Virginia is considered Southern in some aspects, but probably more Mid-Atlantic. So what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, man. So I think if I was to be absolutely 100%, very geographically strenuous about this, I would say, definitely Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Western Maryland, I think has a lot more in common with Pennsylvania, whereas Eastern Maryland is closer. The Chesapeake is definitely, at least in the 18th century, more in common with the South. Again, with Virginia, certainly the Tidewater is very much culturally, politically, economically the South. The area that I was discussing, Hampshire County out across the mountains, I would say kind of culturally is much more, again, in tune with Western Maryland, with Pennsylvania. That's where these settlers are largely coming through. That's where a lot of their economic and cultural ties are to. I kind of use that as a broad term just to kind of, how can I best define this tiny little area of, kind of Western Maryland, Western Virginia. But the Mid-Atlantic is a broader region. I certainly wouldn't call all of Virginia or Maryland at this time Mid-Atlantic.
Right. I have one question coming up. I'll get to that in a second. Let me ask you just a kind of a generic, broad question. And, you mentioned what happens to some of these men after Claypool's rebellion and up there in the Frederick Seven. So, and some of them go back, you said, in the Continental Armies, it's just crazy, right? I mean, we don't even think about that today. We think, you're either British, you're Patriot or Whig, you're a Loyalist, and the complexities of this situation just highlights the fact of the Civil War aspect, right? Like, this is basically a civil war in many respects. So how many, and if you don't know this, Travis, I'm putting you on the spot here, so that's okay. But how many of these Loyalists do you think, when the war was over and the United States was created, how many of them do you think actually leave and go to Canada or go someplace else and just totally leave, just refuse to stay here, they just leave? What do you think?
As far as the men involved in these two episodes,
that or in just like in general, I mean, which this is hard to answer, but in general,
in general, kind of the numbers that scholars today give to the number of Loyalists who actually leave the new United States is somewhere in the number of about 80,000. So it's a pretty substantial number of people. Most will go to Canada, some will go to the West Indies. Very few returned to Britain because, of course, these people aren't really British. In many cases, these families had been here for generations, over a century. America is home to them.
Right.
So about 80,000 total Loyalists will leave. As far as in these particular instances, Claypool's rebellion and this Maryland conspiracy, we don't really know for sure. I imagine very few of them. Right. I think these people are generally the rank and file, if we want to call them that, are pretty, we're talking about poor farmers, small family farmers, like artisans, middle-class people. They had not necessarily bet everything on the British Army. They hadn't gone over and enlisted, actually joined with Cornwallis. So I think it was easier for them to kind of reintegrate back into society. They definitely play up this, we were deluded, we were led by these ringleaders who kind of talked us into this, we didn't really mean it.
Right.
My good friend Stephanie Seal Walters has done a lot of research on Virginia loyalism in particular, and she's found at least one account of one of these suspected loyalists out in Western Virginia, who's later involved in, I think it's like either a suicide or a murder that happens like 20 years down the road, and it was in some ways related back to the stance he had taken during the war. But I think for the most part, these people, the ones who are pardoned at least, make a pretty good faith effort to kind of reintegrate into society. As I said, some of these guys, especially the deserters from the army, they go back into the army, they form these companies, say, we were wrong, we'll go help the war effort.
Right.
It's really it really falls most heavily on the ringleaders.
Sure. So we're going to ask one more question. We have a couple other questions that we don't have a lot of time for, but what we'll do, Travis, is I will email them to you and we'll get the answers to those participants. So I will get to Blaine's question here. Were these and other Loyalist groups aware of other groups in the area, activities or activists in other parts of the colonies? I think he's trying to think, did they ever create some kind of Loyalist network? Were these pockets of rebellions, pockets of Loyalists, did they ever try to get together in some kind of fashion and work together?
That's a great question.
It is, isn't it?
That is a really good question. In the minds of the kind of congressional authorities, they absolutely believe that this was part of a widespread conspiracy, that there was coordination between these groups. As I said, that's kind of the difference between what's happening in 1781 and what had happened earlier in the war. This belief that this is part of something bigger. In reality, probably not as much. There's, as I said, there's some fear that there's English agents operating with Claypool's guys, kind of whipping these guys up into a frenzy. Early on in the war, in 1775 and 76, they start rounding up suspected Loyalists in Maryland and Virginia because there's this idea that they're going to raise like groups of Indians on the frontier that are going to link up with them, and they're going to march east and burn everything in the Tidewater. There's a fear of this conspiracy, but there's very little actual evidence that this is happening in Maryland or Virginia. Now, in places where the British Army is well established and where loyalism is a bit stronger and where you're actually seeing the raising of provincial regiments, yes, there is much more coordination. Places like northern New Jersey, places like the area around New York City, in the Carolinas, when the British Army arrives there is a bit more coordination, but that seems to take place mostly wherever the British Army and kind of the British political infrastructure exists. Out here on the frontier, it's kind of like these things are kind of every man for himself.
Right. Okay. Great. Well, hey, thank you, Travis. I knew a little bit about Claypool, but not as much as you just covered. So I appreciate that. I knew nothing about the Frederick Seven, which is amazing. Yeah. Cool. Great story. I know you love Frederick, so it's very apropos you brought that up. So thank you for that. We will see you at the end of the day for our panel. Some of these other questions I may bring up in the panel. So Glenn and Jim.
Unfortunately, you will not be seeing me at the panel. Okay. I have another commitment, but
that's
please,
right. That's right.
We'll pass
email
along
to you.
My email. Yeah, email these questions to me, and it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you guys so much.